Hey guys, welcome to History for Hours. Here we dive into incredible true stories that shaped the world, told in a way that keeps you hooked from start to finish. Before we get started, drop a comment with your city and the time you're watching this. I'd love to see where everyone's tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories that bring history to life, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Let's get into it. He was the man behind the curtain, the one who never swung a fist but changed the way crime was run in America. They called him the brain, the big bankroll, the gambler, who could bend fortunes with a single glance at the cards. He was whispered about in smoky back rooms and respected in circles where money was the only language that mattered. When rival gangsters fought in the streets, Arnold Rothstein sat calmly in tailored suits, turning chaos into opportunity. He didn't just gamble at tables, he gambled with history. And in that gamble, he taught an entire generation of future mobsters how to think like businessmen. This is his story, the rise and fall of the man who built the blueprint for modern organized crime. Arnold Rothstein was born in New York City in 1882 into a family that believed strongly in respectability. His father, a wealthy businessman nicknamed Abe the Just for his honesty, wanted his son to follow in the same footsteps. But Arnold was different. He had an instinct for numbers, a fascination with games of chance, and an insatiable appetite for risk. As a boy, while his teachers lectured, his mind drifted to dice and cards. He was not reckless, he was calculating. He saw patterns others missed, opportunities others overlooked. His world was not about rules, but about bending probabilities until they worked in his favor. As a young man, he drifted into pool halls and gambling dens, places his father disapproved of. But for Arnold, these were classrooms. He watched players bluff, counted cards, studied human behavior. He realized that gambling was less about luck and more about psychology. People gave themselves away with gestures, glances, nervous habits. Rothstein trained himself to read them as if they were open books. Soon, he wasn't just another kid in the hall. He was the one others avoided playing against because he rarely lost. By his 20s, Rothstein was already operating beyond the average gambler's reach. He loaned money to bettors, took percentages from games he didn't even play, and positioned himself as the man who could bankroll any scheme. His nickname, the Big Bankroll, was not just for show. He always had cash, and in an era when credit was scarce, that gave him power. He became a financier of risk, not merely a participant. If someone needed backing for a racetrack fix, a card game, or later, a bootlegging operation, Rothstein was the man to see. He understood early on that influence mattered as much as money. He cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, police officers, and journalists. In return for favors, he provided financial backing or discreet assistance. These connections allowed him to operate with a level of safety most gamblers never enjoyed. While others were arrested or chased out of town, Rothstein remained untouchable, protected by the very system that was supposed to police him. His empire expanded during Prohibition. When the sale of alcohol was outlawed in 1920, Rothstein recognized opportunity. Liquor became gold, and those who controlled it became kings. He financed bootleggers, bankrolled smuggling operations, and invested in speakeasies across New York. Unlike gangsters who relied on muscle and intimidation, Rothstein relied on structure. He treated his ventures like businesses, with managers, distributors, and careful accounting. This professional approach allowed him to profit steadily while others stumbled. It was during this era that he became a mentor to younger men who would later dominate organized crime. Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, all looked to Rothstein as a teacher. He showed them that brute force could win battles, but intelligence and organization won wars. He taught them how to launder money through legitimate fronts, how to negotiate with politicians, how to build networks that extended beyond the underworld. To them, he was not just a boss, but a professor, the man who turned street crime into corporate crime. Perhaps the most infamous chapter of his career came in 1919, when whispers spread about the World Series. The Chicago White Sox, favored to win, played poorly against the Cincinnati Reds. Soon rumors erupted that the games had been fixed. Behind it all, people whispered, was Arnold Rothstein. Though he was never convicted, his name became forever tied to the scandal. The idea that a single man could reach into America's pastime and tilt it shook the country. Rothstein denied involvement, insisting he had nothing to do with it. But few believed him. To many, the Black Sox scandal proved his power reached further than anyone realized. Rothstein himself remained calm in the storm. Whether he was truly behind the fix or merely profited from it, he moved forward as though untouched. That was his way. Never flustered, never panicked, always appearing 2 steps ahead. He believed in keeping emotions out of business. Where others shouted, he spoke softly. Where others drew guns, he drew contracts. He saw crime not as chaos but as enterprise, and that perspective separated him from nearly everyone else of his time. His lifestyle reflected his success. He dressed impeccably, moved in elite circles, and dined in the best restaurants. He mingled with actors, politicians, and financiers, blurring the line between legitimate society and the underworld. People who might never sit at a table with a gangster were comfortable sitting with Rothstein, because he carried himself not as a thug, but as a businessman. That presentation was part of his genius. Respectability was a mask he wore so well that many forgot what lay behind it. But beneath the calm exterior, Rothstein never lost his love for gambling. High-stakes poker games, horse races, and dice tables were not just pastimes. They were arenas where he tested his skill, measured his instincts, and proved his dominance. He bet large, often shocking those who played against him. But to Rothstein, money was not the point. Control was. Winning meant showing that his mind was sharper, his patience greater, his ability to read others unmatched. By the late 1920s, Rothstein was at the height of his power. His influence touched nearly every corner of New York's underworld. Bootlegging, narcotics, gambling, real estate. His fingerprints were everywhere. Yet with power came enemies, rivals who resented his calm dominance, men who grew impatient with his control of the bankroll. And behind the polished exterior, Rothstein faced the same risks as every gambler, the possibility that one game, one deal, one betrayal could unravel it all. For now, though, he remained untouchable. The boy who once dreamed over dice in back rooms had become the brain, the mentor of bosses, the man who taught crime to think like business. His empire stretched wide, his legend grew, and the world was just beginning to grasp the full measure of Arnold Rothstein's reach. Arnold Rothstein carried himself like a man who could see 2 moves ahead of everyone else. He had built a reputation not only as a gambler, but as a strategist who understood the value of patience. By the early 1920s, his name had spread far beyond New York's card tables and racetracks. He was the brain, the man who never shouted, never threatened, yet somehow always ended up in control. Those who underestimated him soon realized that Rothstein didn't need to swing fists or fire guns. His weapon was influence, and it cut deeper than any knife. He made his fortune through gambling, but gambling alone could never explain the reach he achieved. Rothstein used games as entry points into relationships. A man who lost heavily at a poker table often found himself borrowing money from Rothstein, and that debt was the beginning of an alliance. Some repaid in cash, others in favors. Each connection expanded his web of influence. Police officers, judges, businessmen, and politicians all found themselves entangled in ways subtle or obvious. Rothstein rarely threatened anyone. He simply made himself indispensable, and once people depended on him, they were his. His success in bootlegging during Prohibition cemented his position. When alcohol was outlawed, Rothstein saw it as the greatest opportunity of the century. To him, the ban created a vacuum, and nature demanded someone fill it. He financed smuggling operations that brought whiskey from Canada, set up networks that distributed liquor across New York, and invested in speakeasies that flourished under the cover of respectability. Unlike others who rushed blindly into the trade, Rothstein treated it like a corporation. He kept books, tracked profits, and demanded organization. His style of management transformed chaos into efficiency, and this model would later become the foundation for organized crime as a whole. It was during this time that he became a mentor to younger men who would later shape the mafia's golden age. Lucky Luciano admired his composure, learning how to balance charm with ruthlessness. Meyer Lansky studied his mathematical precision, realizing that numbers could be more powerful than muscle. Frank Costello absorbed his lessons on politics, understanding that influence with lawmakers was as vital as street control. For these men, Rothstein was not just another boss, he was the teacher who showed them that crime could be professional, disciplined, and sustainable. Rothstein's approach made him respected, but it also set him apart. Traditional gangsters viewed him with suspicion. He didn't behave like them, didn't live in their world of constant brawls and flamboyant displays. He moved in high society, attending Broadway shows, dining at elegant restaurants, mingling with celebrities. To the elite, he was the gambler with charm, a man who seemed almost respectable. To the underworld, he was untouchable, a figure who never got his hands dirty yet always came out ahead. But with success came tension. Rivals envied his bankroll, his ability to finance operations others could only dream of. Some resented that a Jewish gambler held more power than hardened Italian or Irish street bosses. They whispered about his role in the Black Sox scandal, about his connections to judges, about his uncanny ability to walk away from trouble. Every rumor strengthened his legend but also painted a target on his back. Power in that world never went unchallenged, and Rothstein's rise attracted enemies as well as followers. Despite the whispers, Rothstein remained calm. He moved with confidence, never showing fear, never admitting weakness. His belief in discipline kept him steady even when threats loomed. He often reminded his protégés that emotions destroyed men faster than bullets. Rage clouded judgment, greed blinded foresight, arrogance opened traps. The key, he taught, was to remain detached, to treat every deal, every gamble, every alliance as a calculation. For him, business came before pride. This cold approach made him difficult to predict, and unpredictability was its own armor. His gambling empire continued to grow. High-stakes poker games in luxury hotels became his stage. He wagered sums that left others gasping, yet he rarely lost control. Even when he lost money, he seemed composed, as if each loss was merely another step in a longer plan. To Rothstein, gambling was not just about cards, it was about studying men. Every game revealed character, weakness, dishonesty, recklessness. He cataloged these traits and used them later. A man's behavior with chips often mirrored his behavior with deals, and Rothstein used that knowledge to his advantage. Real estate became another frontier. He invested in buildings, hotels, and properties that offered both profit and a cover for other ventures. He was careful never to rely on a single source of income. Diversification kept him safe, ensured that if one scheme faltered, another would carry him forward. This foresight distinguished him from rivals who placed everything on one gamble. Rothstein always had a second move ready. Yet even as he prospered, he was not blind to the dangers. He knew envy simmered, that rivals circled, that betrayal could come from any corner. His solution was not paranoia, but preparation. He surrounded himself with men he trusted, but he also ensured no one man knew too much. Secrets were divided, responsibilities spread, so that no betrayal could topple the whole. His protégés admired this structure and would later replicate it in their own empires. By the mid-1920s, Rothstein's reputation reached its height. He was no longer merely a gambler or a fixer. He was the model of modern crime. Politicians courted him quietly, rivals studied him, protégés worshipped him. His influence touched bootlegging, narcotics, gambling, real estate, and even sports. The man who once counted dice in back rooms now shaped industries with silent gestures. Yet the higher he climbed, the more precarious his position became. For all his caution, for all his preparation, he lived in a world where one mistake, one grudge, one unpaid debt could bring everything crashing down. Arnold Rothstein, the brain, The big bankroll stood at the peak of his empire, calm as ever, his mind always turning. But beneath the calm, the game was shifting. Rivals plotted, allies grew restless, and the cards on the table were about to change. For a man who lived by chance, the greatest gamble of his life was still to come. The late 1920s were years of roaring confidence in America. Wall Street climbed higher, jazz spilled from nightclubs, and Prohibition turned liquor into the nation's most valuable commodity. For Arnold Rothstein, it was an age made for someone like him, a man who thrived on risk and calculation. He had already built his reputation as the brain, the gambler who never relied on luck alone, but by this time, he was more than a gambler. He was the financier behind countless deals, the silent hand guiding operations from bootlegging to real estate, the man whose approval or refusal could determine whether schemes lived or died. His network was vast. Bootleggers from Canada came to him for funding, knowing his bankroll could move cases of whiskey across borders. Politicians quietly nodded when his name surfaced, some indebted to him for campaign contributions, others cautious of the power he held. Even Broadway actors and producers recognized him as a man whose money could make shows succeed. He moved with ease across different worlds, slipping from smoke-filled poker rooms to elegant banquets, from conversations with gangsters to dinners with financiers. He was both insider and outsider, respected and feared. Yet beneath the polished surface, tensions grew. Rivals resented his control, whispering that he was too arrogant, too secure. Street bosses envied the way he made money without ever firing shots. They risked prison and blood. He sat in fine suits and reaped profits. Some admired him, but admiration curdled easily into envy. Even among his protégés, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, there was recognition that one day they would need to step out of his shadow. For now, they still learned from him, but ambition is restless, and the seeds of future challenges were quietly planted. The narcotics trade was one area where Rothstein's name surfaced repeatedly. Officially, he denied involvement. Publicly, he described drugs as too dangerous, too volatile, the kind of business that attracted too much attention. But whispers persisted that he financed deals in heroin and cocaine, using intermediaries to keep his hands clean. Government reports hinted at his connections. Rivals accused him of hypocrisy, and even some allies wondered how deep his reach truly went. As with the Black Sox scandal, nothing was ever proven. But the idea that Rothstein might have been the first great financier of narcotics added another layer to his legend. His gambling, meanwhile, never stopped. No matter how many businesses he backed, he always returned to the tables. High-stakes poker games became his second office, a place where fortunes shifted with the turn of a card. For Rothstein, these games were not distractions. They were arenas where his mind stayed sharp. He studied men across the table, watched for weaknesses, tested his instincts. Winning mattered, but control mattered more. He could lose thousands in one night and shrug, because for him, the money was fuel, not treasure. The real prize was proving he could read and outmaneuver anyone. By 1926 and 1927, however, cracks appeared. The more Rothstein spread himself across ventures, the more entangled he became. Debts grew complicated, alliances strained. He had always prided himself on staying detached, on keeping emotions out of business, but others were not as disciplined. Men he dismissed felt humiliated. Partners who believed they were owed more began to resent him. In a world built on delicate trust, small slights could grow into grudges, and grudges in that world were deadly. One story often told was that Rothstein had grown careless in a way only power can invite. His gambling debts grew larger, and though he always managed to cover them eventually, some believed he delayed payments on purpose, testing others' patience. To him, debts were part of the game, tools to be negotiated. To others, a debt unpaid was an insult. The man who had always preached calculation may have underestimated how prideful and reckless his rivals could be. At the same time, his presence in high society created friction. The elite accepted his money and enjoyed his company, but whispers followed him into dining rooms and theaters. He was not like them, no matter how fine his suits or how smooth his words. Behind smiles, they remembered the rumors of fixed games, smuggled liquor, and shady dealings. Rothstein cultivated respectability, but he could never erase suspicion entirely. That tension, between the world he wanted to belong to and the world he truly commanded, haunted him in subtle ways. For his protégés, though, he remained the model. Lucky Luciano later admitted that without Rothstein's guidance, he would never have understood how to organize crime like a corporation. Lansky studied his bankroll management, realizing that numbers and discipline could protect empires. Costello observed how politics could be influenced quietly with money instead of bullets. These men would later shape the underworld for decades, carrying Rothstein's lessons long after his death. Yet even as they learned, they also saw his vulnerabilities. His calm demeanor sometimes masked risks he could not fully control. His insistence on being the man behind the curtain left him exposed when the curtain shifted. By 1928, Arnold Rothstein was still at the peak in appearance, but the stage was set for his downfall. The debts piled higher, the rivals whispered louder, and the dangerous mixture of envy, greed, and pride gathered around him like storm clouds. He was still the brain, still the man who seemed 2 steps ahead, but even the sharpest minds cannot predict every card. One game, one argument, one decision would soon lead to the moment where calculation could no longer protect him. Arnold Rothstein believed he could gamble with anything: money, alliances, even time. But in the end, the greatest gamble of his life would not be one he placed on cards. It would be the gamble of trust, and trust in his world was always the most dangerous bet of all. By the autumn of 1928, Arnold Rothstein seemed as polished as ever, walking the streets of Manhattan in tailored suits, carrying himself with the same calm dignity that had made him untouchable for years. But beneath the surface, pressure was mounting. His debts, once carefully managed, had become the talk of gambling circles. For a man who built his reputation on reliability, even whispers about unpaid sums were dangerous. His enemies saw cracks in the armor, and those cracks widened as tempers flared. Rothstein had always loved high-stakes poker, and one game in particular became infamous. Held at the Park Central Hotel in Manhattan, the game drew men who respected Rothstein's bankroll, but also resented his dominance. The stakes were enormous, and Rothstein wagered as confidently as ever. Yet the night turned sour. He lost heavily, more than $300,000, an unimaginable amount in those days. To the others at the table, it was simple: pay the debt and walk away. But Rothstein hesitated. He claimed the game was crooked, that the cards had been stacked against him, that dishonesty tainted the losses. In his mind, it was not a debt at all, but a swindle. Those around him disagreed. In the gambling world, accusations of cheating could ignite fires faster than matches. For Rothstein, refusing to pay carried risks far beyond money. His entire persona was built on trust, on being the man whose word was gold. But Rothstein believed he had been wronged, and he would not pay what he considered illegitimate. That decision set events in motion that no calculation could stop. In the days after the game, frustration grew. Men who had expected their winnings fumed. Some whispered that Rothstein was finished, that the brain had lost his touch. Others feared what his defiance might mean. To leave such a debt unpaid was to show weakness, and weakness in that world invited chaos. Rothstein, calm as always, refused to bend. He had faced pressure before, and his instinct was to outlast it, to remain steady until others caved. But this time, the stakes were different. Pride, greed, and anger swirled in ways even he could not control. On the evening of November 4, 1928, Rothstein was summoned to the Park Central Hotel. Accounts differ on what he expected. Some say he believed it was another meeting to negotiate his disputed debt. Others think he knew danger waited but trusted his composure to protect him. What is certain is that in a quiet room of that hotel, Arnold Rothstein was shot in the stomach. The man who had outplayed rivals for decades, who had turned crime into business, who had walked untouched through scandals, now lay bleeding from a gambler's dispute. He was rushed to the hospital, still alive, his face pale but his composure intact. Reporters gathered quickly, knowing the significance of the moment. Doctors fought to stabilize him, but his condition was critical. Friends and associates visited, shocked that the brain, always untouchable, could be brought down so suddenly. Yet even in pain, Rothstein remained loyal to his code. When police asked who shot him, he refused to answer. "Me mudder did it," he joked with a faint smile, mocking their questions. He would not betray his world, not even to save himself. For 2 days he lingered, his body weakened, his strength fading. On November 6, 1928, Arnold Rothstein died at the age of 46. The news shook New York. Headlines screamed of the death of the king of gamblers, the mastermind of organized crime. Crowds gathered outside his home and funeral, some in awe, others in grim satisfaction. Politicians, police, businessmen, and criminals alike whispered about the man who had built so much and lost it all over a single game. His death left questions that were never answered. Who pulled the trigger? Was it a rival angry over unpaid debt, a partner betrayed, or simply a gambler insulted by Rothstein's accusations? No one was ever convicted. Rumors swirled, suspects were named, but the truth remained locked in silence. In death, Rothstein remained as mysterious as he had been in life. For his protégés, his passing was both a shock and a lesson. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello absorbed the message. Even the sharpest mind could be undone by pride. Even the brain could fall when debts and grudges collided. They mourned him, but they also studied his mistakes. From his downfall, they learned to be more cautious, to spread risks more carefully, to never let pride blind judgment. His death became the final lesson from the man who had taught them so much. The funeral was crowded but subdued. Family, friends, and rivals stood together, bound by the weight of his legacy. Some whispered that he had brought it on himself by refusing to pay. Others insisted he had been cheated, that his refusal was an act of principle. Either way, his legend grew. The man who had fixed games, financed empires, and outsmarted rivals had finally lost his greatest gamble. Yet death did not erase his influence. The systems he created, the methods he taught, the vision he had for organized crime lived on. The men he mentored carried those lessons into the future, building syndicates that dominated America for decades. Rothstein had changed the game forever, and even in death, his fingerprints remained on every deal, every racket, every alliance. Arnold Rothstein's story did not end in that hospital bed. It began again in the hands of those who followed him. His life was proof that crime could be organized like business, that power could come from brains as much as muscle, that patience could outlast violence. His death was proof that even the sharpest brain could not calculate every risk. For all his brilliance, for all his discipline, he was still human, and in the end, humanity was his undoing. The death of Arnold Rothstein sent ripples through every corner of New York. Newspapers printed bold headlines calling him the king of gamblers, the man behind scandals that had shocked the nation, the mysterious financier who pulled strings others could not even see. Crowds gathered outside the Park Central Hotel, hoping for scraps of information while reporters haunted the hospital where he had spent his final hours. Even as his body cooled, his name carried weight, because Rothstein was not just another gambler killed in a quarrel. He was the brain, and his fall meant a shift in the balance of the underworld. Law enforcement swarmed the case, eager to solve what promised to be the most famous murder of the year. Detectives questioned gamblers, bootleggers, even Broadway actors who had once crossed his orbit. Rumors pointed to George "Hump" McManus, a gambler who had hosted the poker game that sparked the dispute. McManus was arrested and charged with murder, but the evidence was weak. Rothstein himself had refused to identify anyone, leaving investigators with little more than speculation. In the end, McManus walked free, and the killing remained unsolved. That silence was typical of Rothstein's world. Men played by rules outsiders never understood, and one of those rules was never betraying another, even in death. While the police searched in vain, the underworld studied the moment closely. Rothstein's refusal to pay his debt, whether out of principle or pride, had marked him in ways he may not have realized. To gamblers, a debt was sacred. To refuse was to invite vengeance. His protégés watched the fallout with careful eyes. Lucky Luciano, who had learned discipline from him, understood that a boss could never afford to appear weak. But he also saw the danger of letting pride overrule practicality. Meyer Lansky noted how quickly trust could evaporate in gambling circles, even when reputations were built over decades. Frank Costello realized how fragile protection from politicians and judges could be once a man's body was lying in a hospital bed. They all carried these lessons into the futures they were about to shape. The legitimate world reacted with fascination and contempt, in equal measure. Wealthy businessmen who had once shared drinks with Rothstein now distanced themselves, pretending they had barely known him. Politicians who had quietly accepted his contributions remained silent. Yet whispers lingered about how deeply his influence had stretched, about how many industries and neighborhoods he had quietly financed. Even in high society, no one could deny that Rothstein had blurred the lines between respectability and crime in ways no one had before. For the street world, his death created a vacuum. Rothstein had been more than a gambler. He had been a banker, the man with the money to back ventures, the figure who tied different factions together. Without him, disputes that he might have mediated boiled over. Some operations faltered without his bankroll, others collapsed entirely. Rivals scrambled to seize control of the spaces he left behind. It was the end of an era where one man's bankroll and intellect served as the glue for so many enterprises. The men closest to him mourned, but also moved quickly. Luciano, Lansky, and Costello realized the blueprint Rothstein had left was too valuable to abandon. They adapted his lessons, building organizations that mirrored his vision. They treated their families not as gangs but as corporations, with structure, leadership, and long-term planning. They avoided reckless fights when possible, preferring negotiations and alliances. They laundered money through businesses, invested in politics, and diversified their enterprises. Rothstein's voice echoed in their choices, even though he was gone. The Black Sox scandal, which had tied his name to the corruption of America's national pastime, resurfaced in the press as people looked back on his legacy. Some blamed him entirely, calling him the man who had dirtied baseball forever. Others argued he was simply a financier who understood that greed could tempt even athletes. The truth mattered less than the perception, and the perception was that Arnold Rothstein had been capable of fixing anything. That idea alone elevated him from gambler to legend, for what could be more powerful than being the man who bent not just cards and dice but the World Series itself? His funeral drew a strange mix of mourners. Family members, grief-stricken, clung to memories of a man they knew in private, a man who had loved fine clothes and conversation, who had shown kindness behind closed doors. Associates from the underworld arrived quietly, their faces solemn, aware that a chapter had closed. Curious onlookers lined the streets hoping to glimpse the send-off of a man whose name had filled headlines for weeks. Even rivals who had resented him could not deny his impact, and some admitted with grudging respect that he had changed the very nature of their world. As months passed, the investigation into his death faded. The city moved on, new scandals filled newspapers, and new names rose in the underworld. Yet Rothstein's legend only grew. He became a figure of fascination for writers, journalists, and storytellers. He was remembered as the man who made crime a business, the gambler who never relied on chance, the mentor of future kings. His death, mysterious and unsolved, only fueled the myth. People wondered if he had calculated even that, if in refusing to pay and refusing to name his killer, he had chosen to exit the stage on his own terms. For his protégés, he lived on in memory and method. Luciano went on to build the Commission, a governing body of organized crime modeled after Rothstein's belief in structure. Lansky created financial networks that mirrored Rothstein's bankroll genius, stretching across countries. Costello turned politics into a shield, echoing Rothstein's quiet investments in influence. Each of them, in their own way, carried him forward, ensuring that the brain never truly disappeared. The lesson of his life and death remained simple yet profound. Intelligence could build empires, patience could preserve them, but pride could destroy even the most careful architect. Arnold Rothstein's empire ended not with police raids or courtroom trials, but with a poker game, a debt, and a bullet. That irony defined him, for he had lived by chance and calculation alike. And in the end, chance claimed him. After Arnold Rothstein's death, the city moved forward, but his presence lingered in every backroom deal, every whispered story, every strategy that bore his imprint. The man had left the stage, but the performance he had set in motion continued without him. In many ways, his real influence only began after he was gone, because those who followed him carried his teachings into a new age of organized crime. Lucky Luciano emerged as one of the brightest examples of Rothstein's legacy. Luciano had spent his younger years studying under the brain, watching how he navigated conflicts without ever raising his voice, how he built alliances with politicians and businessmen, how he treated the underworld as a structured society rather than a street fight. After Rothstein's death, Luciano applied those lessons ruthlessly. He reorganized the Italian mafia in New York, creating the Commission, a governing council that reflected Rothstein's belief in balance and order. While others focused on territory and immediate profit, Luciano thought like a businessman, and that mindset traced directly back to Rothstein. Meyer Lansky, another of Rothstein's students, became the financial genius of the mob. He took Rothstein's knack for numbers and expanded it on a global scale. Casinos in Havana, networks of offshore accounts, laundering systems that baffled investigators, all of it carried Rothstein's DNA. Lansky often admitted privately that Rothstein had been his teacher, the man who showed him how to make money invisible, how to use numbers as both shield and weapon. Rothstein's careful bankroll management became Lansky's guiding principle, and through him, the brain's reach extended far beyond the grave. Frank Costello, too, followed Rothstein's path, though in politics rather than finance. Costello learned from his mentor that influence was more powerful than bullets, that politicians could protect criminals better than armies of gunmen. He built his career on political connections, quietly ensuring that laws bent in his favor, that enforcement looked the other way, that judges leaned toward leniency. Costello's rise as the prime minister of the underworld reflected Rothstein's lessons about subtlety, charm, and the art of blending into high society while still commanding the streets. Even Jewish gangsters like Bugsy Siegel and Dutch Schultz carried fragments of Rothstein's influence. Siegel admired Rothstein's polish, his ability to move in glamorous circles. Schultz, more reckless, nonetheless recognized the importance of financial backers like Rothstein had been. The very idea that gangsters needed financiers, mentors, and strategists came from the brain. Before him, crime had been muscle-driven, chaotic, reactive. After him, it became structured, layered, and deliberately disguised. Law enforcement also felt his presence long after his death. Investigators studying organized crime in the 1930s and 1940s often traced roots back to Rothstein. They saw his methods echoed in Luciano's commission, in Lansky's accounts, in Costello's politics. Detectives muttered that Rothstein had written the manual for modern crime, even if no one had ever seen the manual on paper. His ghost haunted their work, because dismantling the systems he inspired became the obsession of an entire generation of federal agents. Writers and journalists could not let him go either. Books painted him as a mastermind who had corrupted America's favorite pastime by fixing the World Series. Articles described him as a gambler so brilliant he seemed almost supernatural in his ability to read opponents. Some romanticized him as a tragic figure who died over pride in a card game. Others condemned him as the man who proved money could twist anything, even justice. But whether loved or hated, he fascinated, and fascination meant his legend only grew. In Broadway theaters and Manhattan nightclubs, whispers about Rothstein lingered. Performers who had once seen him in the audience told stories of his quiet presence, his sharp eyes, the way he tipped generously, but never extravagantly. Waiters recalled serving him, describing him as polite yet unreadable. These stories, repeated again and again, painted a portrait of a man who seemed larger than life, even in the simplest gestures. His family, meanwhile, carried the weight of his name. Relatives who had once enjoyed his wealth now faced the stigma of his reputation. Some tried to distance themselves, others embraced the myth. Children grew up hearing stories of the brain, sometimes proud, sometimes burdened. For them, Arnold Rothstein was both ancestor and shadow, a reminder that legacies are not always chosen but inherited. The 1930s brought the rise of organized crime as an empire, with Luciano and Lansky at the helm. Journalists covering their operations often described them as disciples of Rothstein, crediting him with shaping their vision. Even when his name was not in the headlines, it was in the background, the silent force guiding strategies. In that sense, death did not end his career. It expanded it, because now he existed not as a man, but as a legend, a story repeated across decades. The irony of his legacy was that it was built not on violence, but on restraint. He had shown that brains could achieve what bullets could not. Yet his own downfall came from a dispute where restraint failed, where pride outweighed calculation. This contradiction made him compelling. He was proof that intelligence could build empires, but also proof that intelligence alone could not erase human weakness. Every gangster who studied him saw both lessons side by side, what to imitate and what to avoid. By the 1940s, Rothstein was remembered almost like a mythological figure in the underworld. Younger gangsters who had never met him spoke of him with awe, repeating stories that blurred fact and legend. Some said he never lost a hand at poker unless he wanted to. Others claimed he could predict a horse race outcome simply by watching the jockey mount. These exaggerations revealed the truth beneath them. To those who came after, he represented the possibility that crime could be more than chaos, that it could be designed, managed, and even dignified. For the wider public, he remained infamous for the Black Sox scandal. Generations of baseball fans cursed his name, convinced he had dirtied the purity of the game. Historians debated his involvement endlessly. Some argued he was the architect, others that he had been unfairly scapegoated. But in either case, his name endured, tied forever to the idea that money could corrupt even the most cherished traditions. Decades after his death, Rothstein's story was still being told, because it was not just about crime. It was about ambition, calculation, and the thin line between legitimacy and corruption. He had shown that respectability could be worn like a suit, that businessmen and gangsters often shared more than they admitted, that power was not about shouting but about smiling at the right moment, shaking the right hand, writing the right check. Arnold Rothstein may have died on the floor of a hotel, shot over a card game, but his spirit lived on in every deal his protégé made, every alliance they brokered, every dollar laundered through clean businesses. He was not just a man, he was a method, a philosophy, a legacy that shaped the entire American underworld. By the middle of the 20th century, Arnold Rothstein was no longer just a memory for those who had known him. He had become a character in America's imagination, a symbol of how money and calculation could bend the rules of society. Though he had died in 1928, his story kept resurfacing in books, newspapers, plays, and later television. For many who never heard his voice or saw his face, Rothstein was a legend first and a man second. Writers were among the first to shape his myth. In the early 1930s, F. Scott Fitzgerald created the character Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby, a mysterious gambler rumored to have fixed the World Series. Everyone who read it understood that Fitzgerald was pointing to Rothstein. That single reference immortalized him in literature, making him part of one of America's greatest novels. From then on, anyone who studied The Great Gatsby also learned about the real figure who had inspired it. Journalists kept his story alive through crime columns and retrospectives. When Luciano rose to power in the 1930s, reporters often reminded readers that he had once been mentored by Rothstein. When Lansky built international casinos, they wrote about the financial genius who had trained under the brain. Whenever Costello used political influence to shield himself from prosecution, Rothstein's lessons on respectability were mentioned. Even decades after his death, his name was shorthand for the idea that brains mattered as much as muscle in organized crime. The stage and screen soon picked him up as well. Characters inspired by him appeared in plays about gamblers and hustlers. Filmmakers in the 1940s and 1950s, unable to resist his story, hinted at him in mob films and noir dramas. Sometimes his name was changed, sometimes not, but the figure of the calm, well-dressed gambler who ran things from behind the curtain was unmistakably Rothstein. Audiences who had never read a headline from the 1920s absorbed his essence through stories that drew from his life. To the public, he was both villain and visionary. Baseball fans cursed him for the Black Sox scandal, certain he had corrupted their beloved sport. Others admired his intelligence, his ability to turn crime into a system. College students studied him in criminology courses, professors using him as an example of how organized crime could evolve from street brawls into corporations. The dual image, corrupter of games and teacher of empires, kept him fascinating because it showed how one man could embody contradictions so completely. For the Underworld, his name became almost sacred. Older gangsters who had known him spoke of him as if he were a prophet, the man who had shown them that chaos could be shaped into order. Younger criminals who had never met him repeated stories that made him larger than life. They told tales of how he could read a poker table with one glance, how he always knew which horse would win, how he turned politicians into partners without them ever realizing it. Most of these stories were exaggerations, but exaggerations have a way of becoming truth when repeated often enough. Law enforcement continued to see him in every structure they tried to dismantle. When the commission was uncovered in the 1950s, when casinos in Havana drew American dollars in the 1940s, when politicians were found to be secretly funded by underworld money, investigators always pointed back to Rothstein. They insisted he had written the original playbook. Even though he had been gone for decades, he was treated as the architect of modern crime, the man whose ideas had outlived his body. Hollywood brought him back again in the 1960s and 1970s with films that hinted at his life. Characters modeled on him appeared as dignified gamblers who spoke softly, but carried enormous influence. Writers of crime dramas often used his style to contrast against violent gangsters, showing audiences that power could come from calm calculation as much as from force. The quiet boss in the corner, the financier in a tailored suit, the gambler with a smile that revealed nothing, all of these archetypes traced back to Rothstein. His presence in American culture only deepened as television and documentaries explored the history of organized crime. Programs about Luciano or Lansky always mentioned him, framing him as the teacher behind the students who built the syndicate. Sports documentaries about the Black Sox scandal kept his name alive among baseball fans. Even college lectures on American corruption used his story as a bridge between the Gilded Age of politics and the Prohibition era of crime. By the mid-20th century, Rothstein was not just remembered, he was studied. Among ordinary people, his legend took on an almost folk-like quality. Taxi drivers in New York told passengers about the gambler who had fixed the World Series. Bartenders in speakeasy-themed bars whispered his name as if invoking a ghost. Writers described him as a man who lived in the spaces between shadow and respectability, someone who could dine with a governor one night and bankroll bootleggers the next. His ability to move seamlessly between those worlds made him both mysterious and magnetic. For his family, the legend was more complicated. They bore the name with pride in private but carried the weight of infamy in public. Descendants found themselves explaining again and again who he had been, defending or condemning depending on the audience. Some saw him as proof of brilliance, a man who rose from nothing to shape history. Others felt burdened by his choices, the way his story tied forever to crime. In either case, they could never escape him, because his name had entered the permanent record of American history. The most striking thing about Rothstein's legacy in the mid-century was how it grew larger the further away people moved from the facts. The man who died over a poker debt became in memory the man who could outthink entire cities. The gambler who once worried about debts became in legend a flawless strategist who never lost. Reality and myth blurred, but myths often last longer than truth. In that blur, Arnold Rothstein lived on. By the 1970s, gangsters and gamblers alike still quoted him as if he were alive. They spoke of his rules: stay calm, treat crime like business, keep politicians close, never act in anger. These became principles repeated by men who had never shaken his hand. The irony was that Rothstein himself had broken one of those rules in his final years by letting pride interfere with business. Yet legends have a way of trimming flaws, and so his death over a card game became less important than the idea that he had been the brain behind everything. Arnold Rothstein had become more than a man. He was a symbol. He symbolized the transformation of crime into structure, the merging of respectability with corruption, the danger and allure of gambling, not just with cards, but with history itself. Long after his body was laid to rest, his mind, his methods, and his myth carried forward, shaping both the underworld and the stories people told about it. By the late 20th century, Arnold Rothstein had become less a memory and more a fixture in American culture. Decades after his death, his name still appeared in print, his story retold in classrooms, on television screens, in documentaries, and in novels. The world no longer debated whether he had truly fixed the World Series or whether his hands were clean in narcotics trade. Instead, the world embraced the legend, the larger-than-life image of a gambler who had turned crime into something resembling a corporation. In the 1980s, crime historians renewed interest in Rothstein as part of a larger fascination with organized crime. Books poured out on Luciano, Lansky, and Costello, and almost all of them included Rothstein as the teacher. Scholars began to argue that without him, the American mafia would have remained fractured, violent, and unsophisticated. They credited him with providing the intellectual framework that allowed men like Luciano to rise above petty disputes and build an empire that spanned the nation. Some historians disagreed, suggesting his influence had been exaggerated, but the very fact that they debated him showed his continuing hold on the imagination. Television brought him to a new generation. Documentaries on Prohibition almost always featured segments on Rothstein, showing grainy photographs of him in tailored suits, his eyes sharp, his smile faint. Narrators described how he bankrolled bootlegging, financed speakeasies, and blurred the line between criminal and businessman. Sports programs covering the Black Sox scandal invariably mentioned his name, often casting him as the shadowy figure behind the players who betrayed baseball. Each retelling reinforced the idea that Rothstein's reach extended into every corner of American life. Novels and films used him too. Writers drew characters based on his quiet power. The gambler who spoke softly but controlled everything. The financier who never showed his hand but always seemed to win. Hollywood crime epics hinted at him without naming him, their calm strategists carrying his fingerprints. Even musicals and stage productions set during the Roaring Twenties often included Rothstein-inspired gamblers, charming but dangerous, intelligent but ruthless. For audiences, he became a type as much as a person, the brain behind the operation. In universities, professors discussed him in lectures on American corruption. He served as a bridge between political scandals of the Gilded Age and the rise of organized crime during Prohibition. Students studied how he used money to influence politicians, how he blurred legality by mixing investments in real estate and entertainment with gambling and smuggling. He became a case study in how systems of power overlap, how respectability can disguise corruption, and how intelligence can transform even the underworld. Meanwhile, the underworld itself had not forgotten him. Gangsters of the 1970s and 1980s still invoked his name. They quoted his principles: keep calm, treat crime as business, never let pride overtake profit, use brains before violence. Ironically, Rothstein himself had failed in that last lesson at the end of his life, letting pride over a card game spark his death. But legends simplify reality, and his followers remembered only the polished figure who never seemed shaken. Even men who had never been born when he lived carried his lessons as if he had personally taught them. The rise of Las Vegas casinos also carried echoes of Rothstein. Though he had died long before the desert city rose into an empire of neon, his protégés shaped the gambling industry there. Lansky and Siegel's ventures in Havana and Las Vegas carried forward Rothstein's love of numbers, his belief that gambling could be managed as legitimate enterprise. When tourists placed chips on roulette tables in the 1970s, they unknowingly played in a system Rothstein had dreamed of decades earlier, a gambling empire dressed in legitimacy, controlled by those who studied the brain. Public fascination also lingered because Rothstein's story carried contradiction. He was polished, intelligent, and refined, yet also ruthless, manipulative, and secretive. He moved in high society but funded speakeasies in dark alleys. He loved numbers yet gambled with his own life until the odds turned against him. This duality made him compelling because he was not a caricature of violence, but a portrait of complexity. He embodied the American paradox: ambition, brilliance, greed, and downfall all in one. Writers in the 1990s portrayed him as the origin story of the mob. They described him as the hinge between the old chaotic gangs of the 19th century and the sophisticated syndicates of the 20th. They credited him with teaching organization, financing alliances, and proving that brains could dominate where bullets could not. In these retellings, Rothstein became almost mythic, a founder figure like a father of an empire. Some even called him the Moses of the mob, guiding a generation out of chaos into structure. Sports. Historians kept his name alive through baseball's darkest chapter. Every new book or film about the 1919 Black Sox scandal mentioned Rothstein. He remained the shadowy financier in every retelling, sometimes directly blamed, sometimes treated as rumor, but always present. Baseball fans debated his role, some calling him the villain who destroyed innocence, others noting that the players themselves had chosen greed. Regardless of opinion, Rothstein's name guaranteed attention because it symbolized the corruption of something America cherished. By the end of the century, Rothstein was more famous in death than he had ever been in life. He had lived quietly, avoiding flamboyance, but legends thrive on mystery, and his quiet nature allowed storytellers to shape him into whatever they needed. To some, he was the mastermind behind every crooked deal of the 20s. To others, he was the teacher who built the modern mob. To still others, he was a gambler undone by his own stubbornness. The real man disappeared into the fog of memory, but the legend of the brain remained bright. For his descendants, the name continued to be both gift and burden. Journalists sought interviews, curious about the family of the man who had fixed the World Series. Some relatives tried to live quietly, distancing themselves. Others embraced the notoriety, telling stories with pride. Either way, the name Rothstein carried recognition wherever it was spoken, ensuring that anonymity was never an option. What kept his story alive through the 20th century was not only what he did, but what he represented. He was proof that intelligence could be more dangerous than violence, that corruption could wear silk suits and polished shoes, that crime could infiltrate every layer of society without ever needing to shout. He was the quiet voice in the room that everyone listened to, the man who never needed to raise his hand because his bankroll spoke louder than bullets. Arnold Rothstein had lived only 46 years, but by the year 2000, his influence stretched across a century. His lessons had shaped Luciano's commission, Lansky's banking systems, Costello's political empire. His legend had been woven into literature, films, lectures, and documentaries. He was gone, yet present everywhere, a ghost who refused to fade because too many stories needed him. The 21st century arrived and nearly 100 years had passed since Arnold Rothstein's death, yet his name had not disappeared. If anything, it had gained new life. History has a way of keeping certain figures alive, and Rothstein remained one of them because his story contained all the ingredients of legend: ambition, intelligence, corruption, betrayal, and mystery. He was no longer just a man who had lived in New York during the Roaring Twenties. He was now a permanent part of American culture. Documentaries on the Prohibition era almost always featured him. Narrators spoke of the brain, the gambler who turned crime into business, the man whose bankroll financed the bootlegging that defined the decade. They showed black and white photographs of Rothstein in his sharp suits, his expression calm, his eyes unreadable. Interviewed historians explained how his mentorship of Luciano and Lansky had created a foundation that outlived him by decades. The audience, many unfamiliar with his name before watching, left with the impression that Rothstein had been one of the architects of 20th century organized crime. Baseball documentaries and retrospectives on the 1919 Black Sox scandal made sure his shadow never left America's pastime. Whether guilty or simply blamed, Rothstein remained tied forever to that fall from innocence. Sports writers spoke his name with a mix of anger and fascination, calling him the man who may have corrupted the World Series, but also the man who proved how deeply money could reach into even the purest games. Every generation of baseball fans revisited the scandal, and with every retelling, Arnold Rothstein's legend grew a little larger. Television gave him renewed fame. HBO's Boardwalk Empire, a dramatized story of Prohibition, featured Rothstein as a major character. Portrayed as calm, precise, and endlessly calculating, the on-screen version captured much of the mystery that surrounded the real man. Audiences who had never read a single book about the 20s now knew him as the quiet figure who never raised his voice yet always commanded respect. The series cemented his place in modern pop culture, introducing the brain to viewers nearly a century removed from his time. Novels, too, brought him back. Writers used his name to add authenticity to their stories of the Jazz Age. Crime thrillers borrowed his style for characters who resembled him, elegant gamblers who controlled events from the background. Even when he was not named directly, his archetype appeared again and again. He became shorthand for the idea of the criminal mastermind, the figure who used intellect rather than violence to control empires. For students of history, Rothstein became a case study in ambition. Professors used his story to illustrate how corruption worked in early 20th century America. He showed that gangsters were not the only ones guilty of bending rules. Politicians, businessmen, and athletes also played their roles. Rothstein had simply connected those worlds, proving that crime could not exist in isolation. It needed allies in suits and offices as much as it needed men in alleys. Younger audiences discovered him not through books or classes, but through internet culture. Blogs, podcasts, and online forums debated his role in fixing the World Series, his mysterious death at the Park Central Hotel, and his mentorship of Luciano and Lansky. Some treated him as a folk hero, praising his intelligence and business sense. Others condemned him as the face of corruption. Either way, he was still being discussed, proving that his story remained alive in digital spaces as well as printed pages. Law enforcement retrospectives also gave him attention. Retired agents and prosecutors writing memoirs often referred to Rothstein as the man who wrote the unwritten rules of organized crime. They pointed out how the commission of the mafia, the national networks of bookmaking, the international laundering schemes, all carried the fingerprints of lessons Rothstein had passed to his students. For these officials, he was not just a historical curiosity. He was the origin point of challenges they had faced throughout their careers. In popular imagination, he remained a contradiction. To some, he was the sophisticated businessman, the gambler who proved brains could rule over brawn. To others, he was the shadowy villain who corrupted America's favorite sport and died over a card game. Both images existed side by side, and that tension kept him compelling. People rarely remember perfect heroes or perfect villains. They remember those who embody both greatness and flaw, and Rothstein was precisely that. His story carried warnings as well as inspiration. To gangsters, his death over a poker debt was a reminder that pride could undo even the most disciplined mind. To gamblers, his rise and fall illustrated both the allure and danger of living by chance. To historians, he symbolized how corruption seeps into respected institutions when ambition is unchecked. Each group found a different lesson in his life, which is why his story never faded, because it spoke to so many different audiences in so many different ways. Even in family circles, his name surfaced. Descendants sometimes gave interviews, speaking cautiously about the man whose legend had outgrown the truth. Some emphasized his intelligence and entrepreneurial skills. Others admitted the burden of being tied to a man remembered as both mastermind and criminal. Within those private conversations, Rothstein remained as complicated as ever, both admired and criticized, both family and myth. By the early 21st century, Rothstein had achieved something few figures from his world ever did. He became immortal in culture. Others of his time, Luciano, Lansky, Capone, remained famous. But Rothstein's uniqueness was that he was remembered not for violence but for vision. He was the gambler who turned numbers into empires, the financier who showed that money could build bridges across crime and legitimacy. His life had been short, ending at just 46, but his story stretched far beyond the years he walked the streets of New York. Arnold Rothstein, the brain, the big bankroll, lived on in every retelling, every documentary, every dramatization. His ghost-haunted baseball stadiums, gambling halls, classrooms, and television screens. Nearly a century after his death, he was still teaching lessons, still sparking debates, still fascinating anyone who wanted to understand how crime, ambition, and business became intertwined in America. Arnold Rothstein's life was short in years, but vast in influence. From his birth in 1882 to his death in 1928, he lived only 46 years, yet the shadow he cast stretched across generations. He began as a restless boy fascinated with dice and cards, and he ended as the man who turned gambling into empire, who blurred the lines between respectability and crime, who mentored the men who would shape organized crime for decades. His story was not just about a gambler or a gangster. It was about ambition, intelligence, and the risks of living in a world where every decision was a wager. Rothstein had been born into a respectable family, one that prized honesty and religious duty. But he carried a different hunger. He loved the feel of games, the challenge of reading opponents, the thrill of turning chance into certainty. That hunger led him into halls of smoke and cards, into the hidden corners of New York where men wagered fortunes. There he honed his mind, mastering the ability to see what others missed, to calculate odds not only in games, but in life itself. His gift was not luck, it was vision, the ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. As he grew, he built himself into the brain, the calm figure who never needed to raise his voice. He financed bootleggers when Prohibition transformed liquor into gold. He backed Broadway shows, racetracks, and speakeasies. He cultivated judges, politicians, and police, ensuring protection when others were dragged off in handcuffs. He wore tailored suits, carried himself with dignity, and earned a reputation not as a thug but as a businessman. To many, he was proof that crime could wear respectability like a second skin. He mentored a generation that would carry his lessons forward. Luciano learned discipline. Lansky mastered finances. Costello perfected political charm. Each of them admitted, in ways open or quiet, that Rothstein had been their teacher. His influence lived in their decisions, their organizations, their legacies. Even after his death, the systems they built echoed his voice, proving that his greatest creation was not a single scheme, but a philosophy that outlasted him. The Black Sox scandal tied his name to baseball forever. Whether guilty or scapegoated, Rothstein became the face of corruption in sports. To some, he was the villain who stained the game. To others, he was the genius who understood greed more deeply than anyone else. Either way, his name became permanent, Whispered in stadiums, written in books, replayed in documentaries. He had reached into America's pastime and left a mark that never faded. His downfall came in the way of all gamblers. One debt, one grudge, one miscalculation. At the Park Central Hotel in 1928, a bullet ended his life over a disputed poker game. For a man who had outsmarted rivals and investigators for decades, it seemed almost cruelly small. Yet that end only deepened the legend. He refused to name his shooter, keeping the code of silence to his last breath. His murder remained unsolved, fueling the mystery. In death, as in life, Rothstein never revealed his hand. After his passing, his legend grew. Writers placed him in novels, filmmakers used his style for characters, historians debated his influence, professors used him as case study, and television revived him for new audiences. He became less a man and more a symbol, a reminder that intelligence can be as dangerous as violence, that ambition can bend institutions, that corruption often hides behind charm. His story crossed from fact into myth because myths are what endure,